Okay, this week's parsha is Parshas Yisro, and this is the parsha in which the Torah was given. So really, anything that has to do with Torah is relevant to the parsha. We can speak about anything. But we'll talk a little bit about Torah itself, and maybe we'll be covering some material that we discussed in the past, but it's always important to reinforce. When we talk about the giving of the Torah, which took place on the holiday of Shavuos, the 6th of Sivan, what does that mean exactly? What was given on the 6th of Sivan? The entire Torah scroll, from Bereshis until the end of Devarim? Can't be, because the Torah scroll records historical events that took place after the 6th of Sivan. The 6th of Sivan, the day of Revelation, was at the beginning of the 40 years, and the Chumash contains an account of events at the end of the 40 years. So obviously the Torah scroll wasn't given. So what are we talking about? So there really are several disputes in the Talmud that relate to this question of exactly what was given when. And the first thing we have to understand is this, that what was given at Har Sinai, what was given at Mount Sinai, was the body of 613 mitzvahs, not the entire Sefer Torah from beginning to end. The 613 mitzvahs were given at Har Sinai, but not on the 6th of Sivan. The 6th of Sivan was the day of the revelation of the Ten Commandments, the Aseret Sedibros. When the Jews stood at Har Sinai and God revealed himself on that day, he taught the Jews the Ten Commandments. Over the next 40 days, Moshe was in Har Sinai. Moshe was given the 613 mitzvahs. That's what happened on Har Sinai. So again, on the first day of the 40 days, which was the 6th of Sivan, or I should say better, the day before the 40 days, the 10 Commandments were taught to the Jewish people. They heard the 10 Commandments from God himself. Over the next 40 days, Moshe Rabbeinu was taught the rest of the 613 mitzvahs. Regarding this teaching of the 613 mitzvahs, there's a dispute in the Talmud between Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Yishmael says, Klolais nemru b'Sinai, that the 613 mitzvahs were only given in generalities. Upratais, the details, were added later, ba'ol moed, in the sanctuary. But when the sanctuary was built, and Moshe would speak to God in the sanctuary, that's when the details were filled in. So, Klolais nemru b'Sinai, the generalities, the general ideas of the 613 mitzvahs were given at Sinai. Upratais, the details, ba'ol moed, were given in the sanctuary. That's Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Akiva argues, and he says, Klolais upratais nemru b'Sinai. The 613 mitzvahs were given both in a general sense and in a detailed way. V'nishnu ba'ol moed, they were reviewed in the sanctuary. Now, the question that Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva are coming to address is really this. If you look in the Chumash, we find there are certain mitzvahs that are given in the book of Shemos and are written as if they were said at Har Sinai. If you look in the book of Vayikra, we have other mitzvahs which were seemingly given to Moshe Rabbeinu in the sanctuary. The book of Vayikra says in the first verse is what God taught Moshe Rabbeinu in the sanctuary. So where were they given? At Har Sinai or in the sanctuary? So Rabbi Shmuel says that the resolution of this contradiction is that in a general sense all 613 were given in the Har Sinai, and the details were filled in the sanctuary. And Rabbi Akiva says no, everything was given in Har Sinai, both in a general sense and a detailed way, but it was reviewed in the sanctuary. Sometimes the Torah records the first teaching, sometimes the Torah records the review. Okay, that's that. When was the text of the Torah scroll given? When was the text of the Sefer Torah given? So here there's another dispute in the Talmud. One opinion says that Torah, Megillah, Nitna. The Torah was given in installments. That over the 40 years, God dictated to Moshe Rabbeinu Parshias, chapters, and the chapters ultimately were assembled to form the completed Sefer Torah. There's another opinion which says Torah Chasuma Nitna. The Torah was given complete. At the end of the 40 years, God dictated the text of the Sefer Torah from the Beis of Bereshis to the Lamed, which ends the book of Devarim. This was dictated to Moshe Rabbeinu at the end of the 40 years. So there's a dispute. So again, when it comes to the 613 mitzvahs, everyone holds they were given at the very beginning, at least in a general sense. According to Rabbi Akiva, even the details. When it comes to the text of the Sefer Torah, either it was given in installments over the 40 years, or dictated completely at the end of the 40 years. So this is important to understand. The person has to know this, because otherwise there's a lot of confusion. You tend to think that if the Torah was given in Har Sinai, the Torah contains historical records of things which happened afterwards. So how could it be given before? The answer is no. At Har Sinai, what was given, 613 mitzvahs. First, the 10 commandments, and then over the 40 days, the rest of the 613 mitzvahs. The Sefer Torah, which aside from mitzvahs also includes historical accounts, that was given either in installments, each installment being given after the events occurred, or it was dictated entirely at the end of the 40 years. Okay, that's just to keep things in perspective. Now, were the mitzvahs given in Har Sinai? Because we know nowadays that we have Torah Shebechsav and Torah Shebal Peh. We have the written law and we have the oral law. The written law is the text of the Chumash. The oral law is the body of interpretation that was given orally by God to Moshe Rabbeinu. How was it given originally? So the Rambam explains, this is a very, very important thing. When we talk about the way the mitzvahs were given, there is what we will call text and commentary. Now this, by the way, is a technique, a literary technique, which was used by many, many authors in our literature. For example, Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, the great author of the Mesilas Yesharim and many other books, wrote an introduction to Kabbalah called the Kalach Pischei Chachma, the 138 entryways to the esoteric wisdom. And he wrote it in the manner of text and commentary. He wrote 138 short paragraphs, and then he wrote a commentary to each of the paragraphs. So if you look at this book, above the line you'll have the text, below the line you'll have the commentary. But by contrast to the commentaries with which we're familiar, in which one person wrote the text and someone else wrote the commentary, here he wrote the text and the commentary. So you might ask, that doesn't make any sense. In other words, if you have Reuven writing the text and Shimon writing the commentary, I understand. Reuven wrote a text which is concise, lacking clarity, and someone else came and writes a commentary to explain it, to elucidate it. Well, what's the idea of the same person writing the text and the commentary? It's a technique. The idea is this: that for the purpose of retention, being able to commit it to memory, to be able to review it, so he first lays it down in very concise statements. Now, each of those statements would not be self-understood. It requires the commentary to understand it. But once you've gone through the commentary once, and you go back to the text, you see that it's all contained in the text. From this point onward, to review, you don't have to read the commentary again. All you need to do is review the text. So the Rambam writes that when the 630 mitzvahs were given to Moshe Rabbeinu, they were also given in the manner of text and commentary. Both were oral. Nothing was written yet. But the way God gave it is, He gave Moshe Rabbeinu a text orally, and then the commentary to the text. So, for example, let's take the prohibition of meat and milk in the Torah. The Torah 3 times says, Lo sevashel gedi b'chalev yimo. Do not cook a goat in its mother's milk. And this is repeated 3 times. So Chazal tell us why it's repeated 3 times. One time tells us the prohibition of cooking meat and milk together. The second time comes to tell us that not only is it forbidden to cook them together, you can't eat the combination. And the third time tells us not only are you not allowed to eat it, you're not allowed to derive benefit from it. For example, you can't sell it in order to make money. So essentially, that's why we have it repeated 3 times. Now, it isn't clear at all. It says, don't cook a goat in its mother's milk. Is it only a goat? What about a lamb? What about a calf? What about an older animal? A cow, a ram, or a fully grown goat? Only in its mother's milk? What about the milk of another animal? So we all know from the oral tradition that goat here is only an illustration and a mother's milk is only an illustration. The rule really applies to all animals and any animal's milk. So these clarifications are part of the commentary. The text are those several words. Lo savashel gedi b'chalev yimo. 5 words. That's the text. And God, to Moshe Rabbeinu, elaborated on the text. And he said, when I say gedi, I don't mean specifically a goat. This is only an example. Likewise, the law applies to other animals. When I say mother's milk, it's not only its mother's milk, the law applies to other animals' milk as well. That's the commentary. So the first time around, of course, you wouldn't understand the meaning of the text if not for the commentary. But once you've heard the commentary once, now you can go back to the text, and when you read the text, you'll recall the commentary. That's how it was given. Originally, both were oral. Later on, the text of the Torah was given to Moshe Rabbeinu. And the text of the Torah includes the historic account of how the texts were given to Moshe Rabbeinu. So the Torah will say, "Vayedaber Hashem al Moshe lemor." God said to Moshe, quote, and we'll have the text. So the text was committed to writing, not the commentary. So at that point, the text became the Torah Shebechsav, the written Torah, and the commentary remained Torah Shebal Peh, remained the oral Torah. And that's how we have written Torah and oral Torah nowadays. But that's only after the text was given at the end of the 40 years. Initially, at Har Sinai, as it was given, both the text and the commentary were oral. The text later was written, the commentary remained oral. Thus, we have Torah Shebechsav and Torah Shebal Peh. But so this is just an overview of how the Torah was given. But I'd like to comment on the issue we mentioned before between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva. That Rabbi Shmuel says the klolais were given in Har Sinai, the generalities were given in Har Sinai, and the pratais were given only in the sanctuary. And Rabbi Akiva says both were given at Sinai. The question is, what is the underlying issue? What are they arguing about? Whether the details were only given later, whether they were given before? What's the issue involved? Now, those of you who know Chumash well know that in this dispute, Rashi takes sides. Rashi, in his commentary, takes sides. In the beginning of Parshas Bahar, so we have there the mitzvah of Shemitah and the mitzvah of Yovel. The mitzvah of Shemitah is every 7 years, that you have to leave the land fallow. The mitzvah of Yovel every 50 years. It's also a special year. No agricultural work is permitted. And it says those 2 mitzvahs are given on Har Sinai. And the question is, why does the Torah make a point of the fact that these mitzvahs are given on Har Sinai? So Rashi quotes the Chazal that this is the source for the position of Rabbi Akiva. This is the source for Rabbi Akiva's position. He understands, just like Shemitah and Yovel were given not only in the general sense, but in the detailed sense at Har Sinai, by analogy, the entire Torah was given again, b'chlalu b'prat, in a general sense, and in a detailed sense, at Har Sinai. Now, where do we see the Shemitah and Yovel were given b'chlalu b'prat? Where do we see that the details were given at Sinai? Maybe this parsha is only the generalities. Maybe the details were left unsaid. So the Ramban points out an interesting thing. The Ramban points out that if you look in Parshas Mishpatim, you'll see that the laws of Shemitah are put in a single pasuk, a single verse. And if you look in Parshas Bahar, you see that the laws of Shemitah span a number of verses. So Rashi understands from that the Torah is hinting to the idea that when it comes to Shemitah and Yovel, both the Klolim and the Pratim, the generalities and the specifics, were given in Har Sinai. Parshas Mishpatim has the Klolim, the general principle, concise, single verse. Parshas Bahar has the Pratim, many verses. By analogy, we say that just like those two mitzvahs of Shemitah and Yovel were given in general and in detail at Har Sinai, likewise with the rest of the Torah. Now the question is, okay, so Rashi takes sides in the dispute. He follows the opinion of Rabbi Akiva against Rabbi Shmuel. But the question is, of all the mitzvahs that we could have used as examples, why is it specifically the mitzvah of Shemitah and Yovel? Why is it these two mitzvahs? That these are the mitzvahs that were chosen to demonstrate the idea that all the mitzvahs were given at Har Sinai. I mean, you could have picked any mitzvah. But why those two mitzvahs specifically? I mean, the idea is as follows. There's a very, very fantastic shaila, fantastic question that the Rambam discusses in the Moreh Nevuchim. The mitzvahs that God gave us, are they rational or are they arbitrary? In other words, the things that God commands us to do, or the thing God forbids us to do, are there reasons why these things must be done or must not be done? Or is it simply that God wanted to reward us for our obedience, and therefore out of the hat, so to speak, he picked, okay, do this and don't do this. But there's really no reason this should be commanded and this should be prohibited. Just, he needed to pick something, because he has to test us, he has to see whether we're obedient. So arbitrarily he decided, okay, these are things you must do, these are things you can't do, but there's really nothing intrinsically wrong with the things that are prohibited, and there's nothing intrinsically right with the things which are commanded. You hear the question? In other words, when God says don't eat pork, is there something wrong with pork, and that's why God said don't eat it? Or is it that God said like this, I want to test the Jewish people, I want to see whether they're obedient. So I'm going to tell them certain things they're allowed to eat, certain things they're not allowed to eat. So God arbitrarily selected beef, good, pork, bad. Could have said the opposite. Could have said, no, pork good and beef bad. Right? But why did he do it this way? Kasha. Kasha v'maisa. We have no way of knowing why he did it that way. It's arbitrary ultimately. Maybe it's even random. But there have to be certain things that are commanded and certain things that are prohibited, and therefore that's why we have these things. But there's nothing intrinsically right about the things that are commanded and intrinsically wrong about the things that are prohibited. That's a good question. It's a good question. The Rambam says that in fact this is a dispute in Chazal. He says there are two opinions in Chazal. The Rambam shows that there are various opinions in the Talmudic literature that revolve around this point. But the Rambam says, but we assume that the mitzvahs are not arbitrary. But we assume, I guess we could say, we rule in halacha, we paskin, that the mitzvahs aren't arbitrary. There's a reason. There's a good reason behind it. In other words, he says that the alternative is hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine that God would do something random, something totally arbitrary. undoubtedly, if God legislates, there must be some wisdom behind it, some chachma, some rationale behind his legislation. And therefore, the things that are spiritually healthy for us, he commands us to do. The things that are spiritually detrimental, he commands us not to do. And there's a reason for it. But the Rambam says something very surprising. The Rambam says, but this only applies to the mitzvahs in a general sense. But if you try to discover the reasons behind the specifics of the mitzvahs, says the Rambam, those are in fact arbitrary. So the Rambam says a surprising thing. He says, for example, the idea of bringing a carbon. There is meaning behind the carbon. He doesn't explain what the meaning exactly is. But there's a reason why God tells us to bring korbanos. You know, if we rely on the interpretations of other Rishonim, a carbon is a symbolic self-sacrifice, if you will. And vicariously, through the sacrifice of the animal, we demonstrate our own self-sacrifice to God. But, says the Rambam, if you're going to ask me a question, then why is it in Rosh Chodesh the carbon is 2 bulls, 1 ram, and 7 sheep, and a goat for a chatas? And why is it that on Yom Kippur the carbon is 1 bull and 1 ram and 7 sheep and the goat? Why not 7 bulls and 2 rams and 1 sheep? So the Rambam says when it comes to that, there's no answer. The details, he had to bring something, so God arbitrarily decided this number of bulls, this number of rams, this number of sheep. There's no cheshbon, there's no reason for the details. That's the Rambam says.
There's no reason we can determine, or God had no reason?
There's no reason. It's arbitrary. It's to test our obedience. Do it this way. But it would have been just as good another way. That's the Rambam writes, surprising, the murder will happen. So the Rambam takes the position, again, that the mitzvahs in a general sense are rational. There are reasons why God tells us to keep kosher and to bring korbanos and to keep Shabbos and so on and so forth. When it gets down to the details, there are no explanations for the details. The details could be arbitrary. That's the Rambam says. Now the Rambam brings a proof to his contention. So there's a medrash which says a surprising thing. It says, we know there's a mitzvah of shechita. If you want to eat meat, you have to slaughter the animal. How do you slaughter the animal? You cut its throat from below. Not from the back of the neck, through the spine, but from below. So the Medrash asks the question, Ma ichpas leila HaKadosh Baruch Hu, what does God care? Whether the shechita is min hatzava or min ha'iref, whether you cut the neck from the bottom or from the back. What difference does it make? What does God care? So the Medrash says, from here we see, Lo nitna Torah el letzaref es abrias. Torah was given to refine us. Torah was given to test us. Which the Rambam takes to mean is a test of our obedience. Meaning, the mitzvah of shechita in a general sense is simply to kill the animal before you eat it. The mitzvah of shechita is not a prescription, or a prescription I should say, to slaughter the animal in a certain way. The mitzvah of shechita simply means you want to eat meat, kill the animal first. As opposed to Ever Min Achai, which is ripping off a limb from a live animal. Jews don't do that. You can eat meat, kill the animal first. How you kill the animal, that's just a detail. What does God care? This way, this way. But that's a test of our obedience. We do it the way God says. But the underlying rationale of the mitzvah would be satisfied however you kill the animal. Whether you cut its neck from the back, or cut its neck from the bottom. That's what the Medrash says according to the Rambam. The Ramban, in Parshas Ki Seitzei, quotes the same Medrash and gives a different interpretation. The Ramban says the interpretation of that Medrash is as follows. What difference does it make to HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Meaning, the mitzvahs don't make a difference to him. When we do a mitzvah, we're not satisfying some need on God's part. We're doing something for us. That the purpose of a mitzvah is to educate us, to inspire us, to train us in a positive character trait or whatever. But not that the mitzvahs make a difference to God. When God commands us to do something, it's not for Him. It's not for His needs. It's for our needs. That's what it means. It was nitna l'tzara v'sabriyas. What difference does it make to God how you shecht? But it makes all the difference in the world to you. That means that the Ramban interprets this medrash in a different way than the Rambam. The Rambam takes it to mean that ultimately the details are arbitrary. The Ramban, the way he reads the medrash, there's no hint to such an idea. The medrash just means that, of course, they're rational, but the rationale is not rooted in God's needs and the divine need, it's rooted in the human need. The human need for self-perfection.
In God's determination.
Right, in God's determination. So therefore we should assume that the Ramban will argue in the Rambam. The Ramban will hold that not only are the mitzvahs rational in the general sense, but they're rational even down to the very last detail. Now it happens to be that if you look at for relatively, I should say, recent Bible commentaries, such as that of Reb Shamshon Hirsch, you'll discover that when he discusses mitzvahs, he analyzes the mitzvahs down to the very last detail and finds meaning and symbolism even in the details. And that obviously is according to the approach of the Ramban, not according to the approach of the Rambam. And sometimes it's ingenious how he'll analyze a mitzvah and he'll cite all the laws that pertain to that mitzvah and demonstrate how each of the laws contributes to the big picture. According to the Rambam, that would be a futile exercise. Because the mitzvahs have no rationale in their details.
The Rambam holds this with Chochim, with Kim, or with Mishpatim, and with Eitz, with every kind of mitzvah?
No, he's saying the mitzvahs whose reasons are not readily apparent. Those
so
are
the ones that are obvious.
They're obvious. But the mitzvahs whose reasons aren't readily apparent, even though we should look for reasons, but only in the most general sense. Because down to the details, we can assume the details are arbitrary. And according to the Ramban, there'd be no reason to assume that.
So he holds you should not steal makes sense as a logic.
Yes, it makes sense. Right.
The social fact.
Right. But not wearing shatnez, right. Not eating meat and milk. So there could be a mitzvah in the general sense. But get down to the details, there's no point in laboring to try to find the underlying rationale. It would seem to me that this dispute of the Rambam and the Ramban really is at the root of the dispute between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva. And I'll tell you why. You have 613 mitzvahs. But we know that the 613 mitzvahs were not all put into practice immediately. We know there are certain mitzvahs that were observed in the desert. Certain mitzvahs only could be put into practice after the sanctuary was built. And certain other mitzvahs only could be put into practice once the Jews entered Eretz Yisrael. So what's the rush? Why did God give us the 630 mitzvahs right off the bat at Har Sinai? Why weren't the mitzvahs given as needed? Now the answer is very simple to that question. Because it's true that the mitzvahs may have been delayed in their practical implementation. But the lessons that are derived from the mitzvahs are relevant immediately. Let's say, for example, let's take a mitzvah which is applicable only in Eretz Yisrael, such as the mitzvah of Shemitah. Every 7 years you have to leave the land fallow. What is that mitzvah meant to teach us? That this is God's world. And therefore we are obligated to use it in accordance with His will. Because we tend to think, if something is mine, it's mine. I can do what I want with it. Who's going to tell me what to do, what not to do? So we have to, no, it doesn't work that way. This is God's world. And how do we impress that fact upon ourselves? Every 7 years we desist from laboring in the ground because it's God's world, it's God's ground. Now, is this lesson only relevant in Eretz Yisrael?
Yes.
Or is this lesson only relevant every 7 years? No. Its practical performance is only in Eretz Yisrael every 7 years. But the lesson which Shemitah comes to teach is true even before we came to Eretz Yisrael, but it's true every year. In other words, the Taryag mitzvahs, the 650 mitzvahs, it may be that in terms of the practical implementation, some of them are only relevant later in Eretz Yisrael or only when the sanctuary is built, but the lessons, the morals that emerge from the 650 mitzvahs are relevant immediately. Let me illustrate this. You know, there are certain mitzvahs, for example, that women are exempt from. Right? Women don't have to put on tefillin. What if a woman, a non-Jewish woman, would convert to Judaism? And she would say, I accept the entire Torah, except for the mitzvah of tefillin. Now, the rule is that if a convert converts, but says, I accept the entire Torah except for one mitzvah, the conversion is invalid. But here, the mitzvah she's rejecting is a mitzvah which she isn't obligated to perform anyway. So what would you say? Is the gerus, is the conversion valid or invalid?
Invalid.
We can make a very strong argument that it's invalid. Why? She wouldn't have put on tefillin anyway. The answer is no. It's true that in a practical sense, a woman doesn't put on tefillin. It's a mitzvah cessation. It's a mitzvah which is time-bound. Women are exempt. But the lessons of tefillin are relevant to women. What does the tefillin come to teach us? That we should subserviate our thinking, that's the tefillin shel Rosh, and our actions, that's the tefillin shel Yad, the service of God. Only men have to do that, not women. In other words, the lesson of tefillin is equally relevant to men and to women. The practical performance of the mitzvah is only relevant to men. But what the mitzvah comes to convey is relevant to women too. And therefore, if a woman converts but rejects tefillin, she's rejecting something which is relevant to her. In other words, there's two different things. There's the performance of the mitzvah lemaisa in practice, and there might be only some people, not other people, perhaps only men and not women, sometimes only women and not men. Sometimes it's delayed in time, not now, only later, in Eretz Yisrael, when the sanctuary is built. But the morals that emerge from the mitzvah, the lessons, are relevant immediately. And that's why the 613 mitzvahs were given at Har Sinai. Because all 630 mitzvahs were immediately relevant. Perhaps not in practice, perhaps not in the practical implementation, but in terms of their lessons, in terms of what we're meant to learn from them, those lessons were relevant immediately. And that's why all 630 mitzvahs were given on Har Sinai. But the details have to be given. Because if we go with the Rambam's approach, that the mitzvahs teach us lessons only in their general sense, but the details are only to test our obedience when we put them into practice. So it was only the klolais, only the generalities were relevant immediately. The pratais, the details, only were relevant when the mitzvah was about to be performed. That's the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael. The klolais nemru b'Sinai. The klolais were given in Har Sinai. The generalities were given in Har Sinai. Because the general principles we needed to know immediately. Because from the general principles we would derive moral lessons. But the details, which are only relevant to the actual performance, could be given later for the mitzvahs whose performance was going to be delayed. That's the opinion of Rabbi SHMOT. But if you hold like the sheet of the Ramban, that even the details have moral lessons, so then even the details were relevant immediately. And therefore, klolais upratais nemru b'Sinai. That's why everything was given, even the details were given at Sinai. Because in the same way that we derive lessons from the klolais, we derive lessons from the pratais. Therefore, everything was immediately relevant. It was reviewed when it had to be put into practice, but it had to be given down to the last detail at the outset. Now, the question we asked was this: that of all the examples the Torah could have given, why did it give the example of the mitzvah of Shemitah and the mitzvah of Yovel? Now, the Gemara in Kedushin says an amazing thing. The Gemara in Kedushin says that these are the two mitzvahs whose practical performance was the most delayed. Because there were certain mitzvahs that were practiced in the Midbar. Certain mitzvahs were practiced when they crossed the Jordan into Eretz Yisrael. Certain mitzvahs only were put into practice after the 14 years of conquest and division of the land. For example, the obligation to give Truma and Meiser, to give the tithes from the agricultural produce of Eretz Yisrael, only was relevant after the 14 years of Kibush v'Chiluk, after the Jews entered Eretz Yisrael, and over the next 14 years conquered and divided the land. That's when this mitzvah became relevant. But Shemitah and Yovel were delayed even further, because the first Shemitah was 7 years after the 14 years, and the first Yovel was 50 years after the 14 years. These are the last two mitzvahs to be put into practice. So the Torah comes to teach us that regarding these two mitzvahs, certainly we would have thought there's plenty of time. What's the rush? That's why it's regarding these two mitzvahs, the Torah says, no, even here, the klolais uprotais were given at Sinai, because the lessons that emerge from the rules of Shemitah and Yovel are immediately relevant. Now, this is a very, very important thing. This is a very important thing to understand. That when it comes to a mitzvah, there really are two different things we're meant to do. We're meant to put the mitzvah into practice in a general sense. In other words, we do the mitzvah, we perform the mitzvah, we blow the shofar, we take the lulav, we give it tzedakah, etc., etc., etc. But there also are the lessons that we're meant to derive from the mitzvah. And that requires a little ingenuity. Sometimes, there are things we can do without thinking why we're doing it. But to maximize what we're meant to accomplish from a mitzvah, we are meant to delve into the mitzvah, think about the mitzvah, and ask ourselves the question, why would God ask us to do this? And from that we can derive moral lessons which are applicable to other areas of life. I would conjecture, furthermore, that sometimes we can only fully appreciate the lessons after we've done the mitzvah. There are certain things we only can fully appreciate through experience. Really discussing it, we can't extract the total meaning. Yes, question.
Okay, so these mitzvahs that are hukim and that, like the milk and the meat, now how could you say, besides it says in the Torah that you have to do it and you got to follow it, what could we learn from it? It's beyond us.
Well, I'll give you an example, right? Obviously, anything we say about hukim is in the realm of conjecture, because we can't say with a certainty this is the reason, this isn't the reason. But for example, Rabbeinu Bachaya brings the PARSHA Mishpatim from the Mukubalim a very interesting thing about meat and milk. We know that there are certain midos, there are certain attributes of God. There's the midas hadin, the attribute of judgment, and there's the midas harachamim, the attribute of mercy, of kindness, of giving. Milk symbolizes chesed. Milk symbolizes kindness, giving. Think about it for a second. What's the greatest gift that a mother gives its child? Nurses the child, right? The verse, Lehagid baboker chazdecha, that we speak of God's kindnesses in the morning, the first letters spell the word cholov. Lehagid baboker chazdecha. Lamed beis ches, rearrange, is cholov. Is milk. Meat is a symbol of the midas hadin, of the attribute of judgment. Think about it for a second. You can't eat meat till you execute the animal. Okay? So meat symbolizes the midas hadin. Now, we know that God runs the world in two ways. Sometimes he displays the midah of chesed. sometimes see displays the midah of din. Are these equally important? Are they of equal stature? The midas chesed and the midas hadin. So the Mekubalim tell us not so. They're not equally important. The fundamental midah, the fundamental attribute of God, is chesed, is giving, kindness. Midas hadin is secondary. Why is there midas hadin? Because God, in His wisdom, said like this: if I want to bestow the ultimate kindness upon you, what is the ultimate kindness? A handout? Or giving you the opportunity to earn your bliss? To earn your bliss. So therefore, there has to be a system of din by which there is a determination of what you deserve and what you don't deserve. Have you earned it? Have you not earned it? So by setting up the system of din, the kindness is facilitated. So therefore the Mekubalim say that the fundamental attribute of God is the midah of chesed. Din is only secondary. Din is only a means of implementation. Now how do you symbolize the idea that these two are not of equal stature? By not mixing them. When you mix two things, that symbolizes that the two are of equal importance, if you can mix them. When you keep them apart, that's because they're different levels of importance. So the symbolism of not eating meat and milk is, don't equate the midas hachesed, which is symbolized by milk, with the midas hadin, which is symbolized by meat. They're not of equal importance. Chesed is superior. Chesed is fundamental. Din is secondary. Okay? Now, that's a conjecture. Rabbi Eliezer says that's the meaning in the mystical sense of this mitzvah. So it contains a very important lesson, right? You may be a vegetarian, and you may be a vegan, so you don't eat meat or milk, right? And yet the lesson, which is derived from basar b'chalav, is something which is relevant. And the point I'm making is that sometimes, to fully understand the lesson of a mitzvah, you have to observe the mitzvah. Let me give you an example. Shabbos. Now, if you read a book about Shabbos, even a very detailed book, you wouldn't necessarily understand anything of what Shabbos is like. If you experience a Shabbos, you have an idea what Shabbos is. So therefore, there are certain things that you can only understand from the doing. As we know, it's actually not in this week's PARSHA, it's next week's PARSHA. The formula with which the Jews accepted the Torah, what was the phrase they used? Nasa v'nishma. We will do and we will listen. And the Gemara makes a point that it seems that they turn things on their ear, because normally the order would be nishma, we'll hear, and then we will do. First you have to hear, you have to learn, know what to do, then you can do it. So what does it mean of nasa v'nishma? We'll do and then we'll hear. There are many, many, many interpretations to this. But to me, the most reasonable explanation is like this: that the nishma over here doesn't mean I will learn enough to be able to do. It means I will delve into the mitzvah and understand, to extract from the mitzvah the lessons that we're meant to extract. In Yiddish, it's like this. In Yiddish, you could say seheren, which means to hear, or you could say tzederheren, which means to really hear the depth of something. Nasa v'nishma means we'll do the mitzvahs, and then nishma, then we'll derher, then we'll understand exactly what the mitzvah is getting at, what the rationale behind it is, what the lesson I meant to learn from it is. Why is the order this way? Because in reality, there are things you only can know from experience. It's only nasa if you do it, then from that nishma, then you can understand it. But this is the important thing. The important thing is to know that mitzvahs are not really things that you do. But mitzvahs are things that you learn from. You have to delve into, you have to think about, you have to reflect on, to derive the lessons which are meant to be derived from that mitzvah. assuming the position of the Ramban, that comes from a detailed analysis of the mitzvah. Because every detail of the mitzvah somehow contributes to our understanding of the mitzvah and the lessons we have to learn. According to the Rambam, it may be that only in a general sense, but according to the Ramban, which seems to be the consensus opinion nowadays, as we said, later commentators embrace that position. That means every detail contributes to our understanding of the mitzvah, and from that mitzvah we can derive moral lessons that are applicable. It's an amazing thing that we don't bring korbanos nowadays. If you ask the average man on the street, like, what does that mean? Like, why don't we bring korbanos? They say we've evolved to a more sophisticated, a higher level. We don't practice these barbaric practices, slaughtering animals, sprinkling the blood. We've sanitized the religion. We're beyond that now. As faithful Jews, we know that's not the case. Because why don't we bring korbanos? Because there are halakhic constraints. Right? Bringing korbanos requires a Beis Hamikdash. We have a Beis Hamikdash. Why don't we build a Beis Hamikdash? There are some halakhic constraints and there are some practical constraints. And I was in Eretz Yisrael, and it's an amazing thing. The coastal, you can't really see what's going on the other side. But Torah built a new building in the old city, and it has a very high roof terrace. From there you can look down on the Temple Mount and see people walking there. You can see the ground of the Temple Mount. And you see it, you go filled with anger. This is our holiest place, and people are walking. So people told me that sometimes you see kids playing soccer there. It's incredible. But it's occupied, and that provides a practical obstacle to rebuilding the Beis Hamikdash nowadays. There are some halachic obstacles too. But that doesn't mean that korbanos aren't relevant in practice. Excuse me, I shouldn't say that. It doesn't mean it's not relevant in theory. It's not relevant in practice. You're not going to actually bring korbanos. But the lessons of korbanos, the morals we're meant to derive from the idea of korbanos, is relevant nowadays.